When billionaire tech mogul James Hernandez heard 7-year-old Britney Gomez whisper, "Please don't leave me alone," in a hospital corridor, his response would shatter every assumption about wealth, privilege, and what it truly means to be a father. What happened next would change not just two lives, but an entire city's understanding of family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled across the hills of Millbrook Valley like a gray blanket, shrouding the exclusive estates that dotted the landscape in expensive privacy. James Hernandez stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his riverside mansion, watching the mist swirl around the perfectly manicured gardens that he paid others to maintain but rarely had time to enjoy. At 34, he commanded a tech empire worth over $2 billion, yet this Tuesday morning felt as empty as all the others had for the past 3 years. The silence in the house was deafening. 23 rooms, each decorated by award-winning designers, each one echoing with the absence of the family he'd lost when his wife Elena succumbed to complications during childbirth. Their son, the child they dreamed of, planned for, prepared a nursery for, had lived only 18 hours. James had buried them both on the same devastating day, and the mansion had felt like a mausoleum ever since. His daily routine was as precise as the algorithms that ran his company. 5:30 a.m. workout in his private gym. 6:15 a.m. protein shake while reviewing overnight market reports. 7 a.m. video conference with his Tokyo offices. By 8 a.m., his driver Marcus would arrive. No, not Marcus. That name was forbidden. By 8 a.m., his driver Antonio would arrive to take him to the gleaming glass towers of Hernandez Technologies in downtown Millbrook Valley, where he would lose himself in code, acquisitions, and board meetings until well past midnight. Money had never been the goal. It had simply been the inevitable result of his obsession with creating something lasting, something that mattered. But lately, James found himself wondering what the point of building an empire was when there was no one to inherit it, no one to share the victories with, no one waiting at home with excitement about his day. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd created technology designed to connect people while living in complete isolation. His social media platforms brought families together across continents. His communication apps helped long-distance couples stay close. His educational software helped parents teach their children. Yet James ate dinner alone every night in a dining room designed for 12. His assistant Valeria constantly tried to manage his calendar to include social events, charity galas, and business dinners that might help him get back out there. But James had little patience for the superficial conversations that characterized most of his social circle. People either wanted something from him, investment money, business partnerships, charitable donations, or they treated him like a celebrity, fascinated by his wealth rather than interested in him as a person. The notifications on his phone buzzed constantly. Stock alerts, meeting reminders, news updates about his company. But there were no text messages asking how he slept, no calls just to hear his voice, no photos of someone's lunch or complaints about traffic. The kind of mundane, beautiful communication that people who had real relationships took for granted. James had tried dating, of course. His wealth made him a magnet for attention, but it also made genuine connection nearly impossible. How could he tell if someone cared about him or about his bank account? How could he trust that their laughter at his jokes was genuine when they knew he could buy them anything they'd ever dreamed of? The few relationships he'd attempted had felt hollow, transactional, lacking the authentic love he'd shared with Elena. This morning felt different, though. James couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the date, October 15th, what would have been his wedding anniversary. Or maybe it was the dream he'd had again, the one where Elena was holding their son, both of them whole and alive and waiting for him to come home. He'd been having that dream more frequently lately, and waking up felt like losing them all over again. His phone buzzed with a text from his corporate security team. There had been a situation at the Riverside Children's Hospital, a data breach that had compromised their patient management system. As the hospital's largest donor and the provider of their entire IT infrastructure, James would need to handle this personally. It was the kind of crisis that would normally irritate him, another demand on his time when he was already drowning in obligations. But today, for reasons he couldn't explain, James found himself almost grateful for the distraction. The hospital held complicated memories. It was where Elena had died, where he held his son for the only 18 hours of the boy's life, where he'd signed papers making him both a widower and a childless father on the same devastating day. He'd avoided the place ever since, sending lawyers and representatives to handle his ongoing charitable commitments. Yet, something was pulling him there today. Maybe it was time to face those ghosts. Maybe solving someone else's crisis would provide the temporary relief from his own that he desperately needed. As Antonio prepared the car, the understated black sedan James preferred for hospital visits rather than his more conspicuous vehicles, James grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. He had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, he would hear 3 words that would shatter his carefully constructed walls. "Please don't leave me alone." He couldn't have imagined that those words would come from a 7-year-old girl whose own world had just collapsed, or that his response would surprise everyone who thought they knew what drove the enigmatic billionaire. Most of all, he couldn't have predicted that this day would mark the beginning of the most important acquisition of his life, not of a company or technology, but of a family he never saw coming. The fog was just beginning to lift as they drove toward the hospital, and for the first time in 3 years, James felt something stirring in his chest that might have been hope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Riverside Children's Hospital smelled exactly as James remembered. Antiseptic mixed with hope and fear, a sterile environment where miracles and heartbreak happened in equal measure. He hadn't set foot in these halls since Elena's funeral arrangements, yet muscle memory guided him through the familiar corridors toward the administrative wing where the IT crisis awaited his attention. Dr. Patricia Vance, the hospital's chief administrator, greeted him in the lobby with the frazzled energy of someone who'd been fighting technical fires all morning. "Mr. Hernandez, thank you for coming so quickly. The breach has compromised our entire patient database, and we can't access any medical records. We have children arriving for surgeries, and we can't even pull up their charts." James nodded, his mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. "How many patients are affected?" "Over 3,000 active files, plus all our archived records. Your security team is already in our server room, but they said you need to assess the damage personally before we can determine the recovery timeline." As they walked through the pediatric wing toward the IT department, James found himself moving through a gauntlet of memories. The nursery where his son had fought for life. The family waiting room where he'd paced for 18 desperate hours. The chapel where he'd bargained with a god he wasn't sure existed, offering everything he owned for just one more day with his family. "Mr. Hernandez," Dr. Vance's voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," he lied, forcing his attention back to the crisis at hand. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The server room was chaos, banks of blinking equipment, cables snaking across the floor, and his security team hunched over laptops with expressions that told him this was worse than anticipated. His head technician, Raymond, looked up as they entered. "It's sophisticated," Raymond reported grimly. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were targeting. They didn't just breach the system, they corrupted the backup protocols. We're looking at potentially losing years of data if we can't reverse the encryption." James rolled up his sleeves, settling in for what he knew would be hours of painstaking digital reconstruction. This was his element, the clean logic of code, problems that could be solved with skill and patience, battles fought with keystrokes rather than emotions. 3 hours later, sweat beading on his forehead despite the server room's air conditioning, James finally cracked the encryption key. The malicious code began unraveling, and one by one, the hospital's systems came back online. Patient records flickered back to life on monitors throughout the building. "You did it," Dr. Vance breathed, watching as the database restored itself. "Mr. Hernandez, you've just saved dozens of scheduled surgeries. These children—" A commotion in the hallway interrupted her thanks. Raised voices, someone crying, the sound of rapid footsteps echoing off the polished floors. Through the server room's glass wall, James could see medical staff rushing toward the emergency department. "I should check on that," Dr. Vance said, but before she could move, a young nurse burst into the IT department. "Dr. Vance, we need you in Trauma Bay 3 immediately. The little girl from the car accident. She's asking for someone, anyone, not to leave her alone. She won't let the medical team near her." James felt something twist in his chest. Without conscious decision, he found himself following Dr. Vance toward the emergency department, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. Trauma Bay 3 was controlled chaos. Medical equipment beeped urgently while staff members tried to calm a small figure on the gurney. As they approached, James could see her clearly for the first time. A girl who couldn't be more than 7 years old, with dark hair matted with blood and eyes that held terror too large for such a small face. "Please don't leave me alone," she was whispering over and over, her voice breaking with each repetition. "Please don't leave me alone. I'll be good, I promise. Just don't leave me alone." The words hit James like a physical blow. Not because of what she was saying, but because of how she was saying it, with the desperate bargaining of a child who had learned that being good might be the only way to avoid abandonment. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician, looked up as they approached. "She was in a car accident about an hour ago. Minor injuries, mostly cuts and bruises, but she's been in this state since the paramedics brought her in. We can't get any information about her family, no ID, no emergency contacts. She just keeps asking people not to leave her." James stepped closer to the gurney, and something extraordinary happened. The little girl's eyes met his, and for a moment her panicked breathing slowed. Something in his expression, perhaps the recognition of one lost soul seeing another, seemed to calm her. "Hi there," James said softly, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "I'm James. What's your name?" "Britney," she whispered, her small hand clutching the hospital blanket. "Britney Gomez. Are you going to leave too?" The question pierced through every defense James had built around his heart. This child, this frightened, injured little girl, was asking him not to abandon her, and suddenly, every rational thought in his head was overruled by an instinct he thought had died with his son. "No, Britney," he heard himself saying, moving closer to her bedside. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay right here with you." Her eyes widened with something that might have been hope. "Really? You promise?" James looked at this broken child, saw himself reflected in her fear of abandonment, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I promise," he said simply. What he didn't realize was that Dr. Vance had been recording the interaction for the hospital's child psychology team, and that his moment of unexpected tenderness was about to become the most viral video in internet history. He couldn't have predicted that his promise to stay would evolve into something neither of them had seen coming. All James knew was that for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The video of James Hernandez, one of the world's most reclusive billionaires, sitting beside a hospital bed holding a 7-year-old girl's hand while whispering words of comfort, went viral within 6 hours. By the end of the day, it had been viewed 12 million times across every social media platform, shared by celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people who couldn't believe what they were seeing. But James knew nothing about the viral sensation brewing online. He was entirely focused on the small girl who hadn't let go of his hand for the past 4 hours, even when the nurses needed to clean her wounds or the doctors performed their examinations. Britney had insisted he stay visible at all times, panic setting in whenever he moved more than a few feet away. "Tell me about your family, Britney," Dr. Martinez had asked gently during the medical examination. But the little girl had only gripped James's hand tighter and whispered, "I don't have one anymore." That single sentence opened a floodgate of questions that revealed a story more heartbreaking than James could have imagined. Britney Gomez had been living with her grandmother, Rosa Gomez, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Millbrook Valley. Her parents had died in a house fire when she was 3 years old, leaving Rosa as her only living relative. The car accident that brought Britney to the hospital had also claimed Rosa's life. The elderly woman had suffered a heart attack while driving, causing the crash that injured Britney but ultimately saved her. So she's completely alone? James asked Dr. Martinez during a quiet moment when Britney had finally fallen asleep, her small fingers still wrapped around his thumb. Child Protective Services is trying to locate any other relatives, but preliminary searches haven't turned up anyone. She'll likely be placed in emergency foster care while they complete a more thorough investigation. Dr. Martinez studied James's face carefully. "Mr. Hernandez, I have to ask, what's your connection to this child? In 15 years of pediatric medicine, I've never seen someone form such an immediate bond with a patient." James looked down at Britney's sleeping face, so peaceful now compared to the terror he'd first witnessed. How could he explain that when she'd begged him not to leave her, it had awakened something in him that had been dormant since his own devastating losses? How could he describe the way her trust had cracked open the protective shell he'd built around his heart? "I lost my son," he said quietly. "He lived for 18 hours after birth. My wife died from complications during delivery." James paused, the words still difficult even after 3 years. "I've spent every day since then wondering what kind of father I would have been, whether I could have protected him, given him the love and security every child deserves." Dr. Martinez nodded with the understanding of someone who'd witnessed countless family tragedies. "And Britney represents a chance to answer those questions? Maybe. Or maybe she just reminds me that some pain is too big for one person to carry alone." James adjusted the blanket around Britney's shoulders. "When she asked me not to leave her, I heard something in her voice that I recognized, the terror of being completely abandoned in a world that suddenly makes no sense." What James didn't know was that his own story was being pieced together by journalists who had recognized him in the viral video. The mysterious tech mogul who rarely gave interviews, who disappeared from public life after his personal tragedies, was suddenly human in a way that captured the world's imagination. The contrast between his enormous wealth and his gentle presence at a child's bedside created a narrative that people couldn't stop sharing. Meanwhile, Britney's background was being investigated not just by Child Protective Services, by internet sleuths who'd become invested in her story. Rosa Gomez had been a housekeeper and seamstress, working multiple jobs to support her granddaughter in a small apartment that was clean but sparse. School records showed Britney as a bright, well-behaved student who often arrived early and stayed late, suggesting she preferred school to being alone at home while Rosa worked. Neighbors described Rosa as devoted but overwhelmed, working 16-hour days to keep up with rent and expenses. She'd never complained, never asked for help, but several people mentioned seeing her counting coins at the grocery store, choosing between necessities. The contrast between Britney's modest background and James's immense wealth wasn't lost on the growing audience following their story. When Britney woke that evening, she found James exactly where he'd promised to be. Sitting in the chair beside her bed, answering emails on his phone, but glancing up every few minutes to make sure she was okay. "You're still here," she said, wonder in her voice as if she'd expected him to disappear like a dream. "I told you I would be." James set aside his phone and gave her his full attention. "How are you feeling? Does anything hurt?" "My head still hurts a little, but not as much." Britney struggled to sit up, and James helped adjust her pillows. "Mr. James, are you really rich, like the nurses are saying?" The question caught him off guard. In his business world, everyone knew exactly who he was and what he was worth before he entered a room. But Britney had no context for his wealth, no preconceptions about what that meant. To her, he was simply the man who'd promised not to leave. "I have money, yes," he said carefully. "Does that matter to you?" Britney considered this seriously. Grandma Rosa always said money doesn't make people good or bad. She said the important thing is how you treat people when you don't have to treat them nice. She looked at him with those wise eyes that seemed too old for her face. You don't have to be nice to me, but you are anyway. The simple observation hit James harder than any business deal or financial milestone ever had. Here was a child who'd lost everything, lying in a hospital bed with no family and no future security, yet she was evaluating his character rather than his bank account. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a very wise woman," James said softly. "She was the best." Britney's voice grew small. "She used to tell me stories about my mommy and daddy when they were little. She said I have my daddy's eyes and my mommy's stubborn chin." Tears began to slip down her cheeks. "What's going to happen to me now? Who's going to tell me stories about them?" James felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The protective instincts he'd thought died with his son came roaring back to life. Without conscious thought, he reached out and gently wiped away her tears. "I don't know what's going to happen," he said honestly, "but I promise you won't face it alone. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out together." Outside Britney's room, Dr. Vance was fielding calls from news outlets around the world, all wanting to know more about the billionaire who'd spent the day comforting an orphaned child. Social media was exploding with theories, praise, and criticism. Some called James a saint, others questioned his motives. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. But in the quiet of room 314, none of that mattered. What mattered was a frightened little girl who was learning that sometimes promises could be kept, and a grieving man who was discovering that healing someone else's broken heart might be the key to mending his own. As visiting hours ended and the hospital settled into its nighttime routine, James faced his first real test. Would he keep his promise to stay, or would he return to his empty mansion and let the system handle Britney's placement? The choice he made would surprise everyone who thought they understood what drove the enigmatic billionaire, and it would set in motion events that neither he nor Britney could have predicted. James had never slept in a hospital chair before, but he'd promised Britney he wouldn't leave, and he intended to keep that promise. The reclining chair the night nurse had provided was hardly comfortable for someone accustomed to Egyptian cotton sheets and memory foam mattresses, but every time Britney stirred in her sleep and reached out to make sure he was still there, James knew he was exactly where he needed to be. At 3 a.m., when Britney woke crying from a nightmare about the car accident, James found himself doing something he hadn't done since his own childhood: telling bedtime stories. He spoke softly about brave princesses who built kingdoms from kindness, about magical gardens where lost children could always find their way home, about grandfathers who became guardian angels watching over their grandchildren. His voice was rusty from disuse, but Britney hung on every word, and slowly her breathing evened out as she drifted back to sleep. Morning brought a parade of people James wasn't prepared for. First came his assistant Valeria, clutching her tablet and looking frazzled in a way he'd never seen before. "James, thank God you're answering your phone," she whispered urgently, glancing at the sleeping child. "Your security team has been looking for you all night. Do you have any idea what's happening online?" "What do you mean?" James kept his voice low, but Britney's eyes fluttered open at the sound of conversation. Valeria showed him her tablet screen. The video of him comforting Britney had spawned hundreds of news articles, think pieces, and social media discussions. #MillionaireDad was trending worldwide. Financial news networks were speculating about his mental state and its potential impact on Hernandez technology stock prices. Entertainment shows were calling it the most heartwarming story of the year. "There are reporters in the hospital lobby," Valeria continued. "Security is keeping them from this floor, but they're not leaving. Everyone wants to know what you're planning to do about—" She gestured helplessly toward Britney, who was now fully awake and listening with the alert attention of a child who'd learned early that adult conversations often determined her fate. "Good morning, sweetheart," James said to Britney, temporarily ignoring the media chaos. "How did you sleep?" "Better because you were here," she said simply. "Who's the lady?" "This is Valeria. She helps me with my work." James turned back to his assistant. "Cancel everything on my schedule for today. and get me the best family law attorney in the state." Valeria's eyes widened. "James, what are you planning?" Before he could answer, a knock on the door announced the arrival of someone who would become crucial to their story, Miss Patricia Wells from Child Protective Services. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too many children in impossible situations. "Mr. Hernandez," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Patricia Wells, and I need to speak with you about Britney's placement options." Britney immediately scooted closer to James, her small hand finding his arm. "Are you going to take me away from Mr. James?" Miss Wells's expression softened as she looked at the little girl. "I'm here to make sure you're safe and well cared for, sweetie. Can you give the grown-ups a few minutes to talk?" "I want Mr. James to stay," Britney said firmly. "He promised he wouldn't leave me alone." "It's okay," James assured her. "I'm not going anywhere. Miss Wells just wants to ask some questions." What followed was a conversation that would challenge every assumption about child welfare, family placement, and the intersection of wealth and responsibility. Miss Wells began with standard questions about James's background check status, his experience with children, his living situation, and his long-term intentions. "Mr. Hernandez, I understand you formed a connection with Britney, and that's beautiful to see. But emergency foster placement requires extensive vetting, background checks, home studies, and training. The process typically takes months." "How long before she has to leave the hospital?" James asked. "Medically, she could be discharged today. We have an emergency foster family that could take her temporarily while we search for relatives or more permanent placement options." James felt Britney's grip tighten on his arm. The thought of her being placed with strangers while bureaucratic processes played out was unacceptable to him. "What if I want to pursue adoption?" The words surprised him as much as they clearly shocked Miss Wells and Valeria. "Mr. Hernandez," Miss Wells said carefully, "adoption is a lengthy legal process. For someone with no prior experience as a guardian, it could take a year or more, and that's assuming you meet all the requirements." "What requirements?" Miss Wells consulted her tablet. "Home study, psychological evaluation, parenting classes, financial assessment, criminal background check, personal references, medical clearance, and a trial placement period. The court has to be convinced that adoption serves the child's best interests." James absorbed this information while Britney watched the adults discuss her future with the resigned expression of someone who'd learned that her preferences rarely influenced these decisions. "What happens to her while all this is being processed?" he asked. "She'd be placed in foster care, hopefully with a family experienced in caring for children who've experienced trauma. We'd arrange supervised visits with you during the evaluation period." "No," James said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "That's not acceptable." Miss Wells blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I said no. Britney has been through enough trauma. She's not going to be placed with strangers while lawyers and social workers process paperwork." James's voice carried the same decisive tone that had built his business empire. "What do I need to do to become her temporary guardian while we work through the adoption process?" "Mr. Hernandez, the system doesn't work that way." "Then we change the system." James pulled out his phone. "Valeria, get me Senator Rodriguez on the line, and call the governor's office." He looked back at Miss Wells. "I'm sure there are emergency provisions for unusual circumstances." Miss Wells looked stunned. "Mr. Hernandez, you can't simply bypass child welfare protocols because you have political connections." "Watch me," James said calmly. "Britney, would you like to come stay at my house while we figure out how to make this official?" Britney's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Really? I can stay with you?" "It is," she said without hesitation. "I want to stay with you." Miss Wells was frantically making notes and phone calls. "Mr. Hernandez, this is highly irregular. I need to speak with my supervisor and the family court judge and—" "Make all the calls you need to make," James said, "but understand this. Britney is not spending another night with someone who loves her. If the system can't accommodate that, then the system needs to change." As word of James's intentions spread through the hospital and beyond, reactions were swift and polarized. Some praised his commitment to helping a vulnerable child. Others questioned whether wealth could simply override established child protection procedures. Legal experts debated whether his approach would help or harm Britney's long-term interests. But in room 314, none of that mattered to a 7-year-old girl who was finally beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face the world alone after all. The afternoon brought Dr. Martinez with discharge papers and a stern warning about watching for signs of post-concussion symptoms. It also brought James's attorney, Margaret Sullivan, who arrived with a briefcase full of legal documents and an expression that suggested she'd never handled a case quite like this one. "James," she said, after reviewing Miss Wells's requirements, "what you're proposing is legally complex and emotionally complicated. Are you certain you're ready for this level of responsibility?" James looked at Britney, who was carefully packing her few belongings, a stuffed rabbit that had survived the accident, and a photo of her grandmother that a nurse had recovered from the car, and felt more certain than he'd felt about anything since Elena's death. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said simply. As they prepared to leave the hospital together, James realized that he was about to take Britney home to a mansion she'd never imagined, to a life of privilege she'd never experienced, and into a legal battle that would test every resource he possessed. But for the first time in 3 years, James Hernandez was no longer just surviving. He was building something beautiful from the ashes of loss, and he finally had someone worth fighting for. The wrought iron gates of the Hernandez estate opened slowly, revealing a world that existed beyond Britney's wildest imagination. As Antonio's sedan wound up the curved driveway lined with ancient oak trees, Britney pressed her face against the window, her eyes growing wider with each passing moment. "Mr. James," she whispered, "is this really where you live?" The mansion came into view, a stunning Spanish colonial revival with cream-colored walls, red tile roofing, and arched windows that caught the afternoon sunlight. Formal gardens stretched in every direction, complete with fountains, rose beds, and perfectly manicured lawns that looked like something from a fairy tale. "It's home," James said simply, though he was seeing it through Britney's eyes for the first time. The grandeur that had felt hollow and excessive for 3 years suddenly seemed like it might have purpose again. Britney's first steps into the marble foyer were tentative, as if she was afraid her shoes might mark the polished floors. The space was vast, 20-foot ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and a sweeping staircase that curved toward the second floor. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, and fresh flowers arranged by the housekeeping staff filled massive vases. "Can I really touch things?" she asked, her voice echoing in the expansive space. "Britney," James knelt down to her eye level, "this is your home too. You can touch anything you want, go anywhere you want, and if you break something, we'll fix it or replace it. Nothing here is more important than you feeling comfortable and safe." Maria Santos, the estate's head housekeeper, emerged from the kitchen with the warm smile that had comforted James through his darkest days after losing Elena. She'd worked for the family for over a decade and had mourned alongside James when his dreams of filling the house with children's laughter had died with his son. "Senor James," she said, then turned to Britney with genuine warmth. "And you must be Britney. Welcome home, mija." Britney moved closer to James, still overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her. "Thank you," she said politely, remembering the manners Rosa had drilled into her. "Maria has been taking care of this house longer than I have. She's going to help us figure out everything you need to feel at home here." The tour of the house took over an hour. Britney's wonder was infectious as they moved through room after room. The library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and rolling ladders, the game room with a pool table and vintage arcade games, the home theater with plush recliners and a screen larger than the living room of her grandmother's apartment. But it was when they reached the second floor that the real transformation began. James had been dreading this moment, showing Britney the nursery he and Elena had prepared with such hope and love. The room had remained untouched since his son's death, a shrine to dreams that would never be realized. "What's in here?" Britney asked, pointing to the closed door at the end of the hallway. James hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "This was going to be my son's room," he said quietly. "He died when he was very young." Britney slipped her small hand into his. "Like my mommy and daddy?" "Yes, like your parents." Together, they opened the door to reveal a space frozen in time. The walls were painted soft yellow, suitable for either a boy or girl. A white crib sat in the center, still made up with sheets covered in dancing elephants. Shelves lined with unread children's books surrounded a rocking chair where Elena had planned to nurse their baby. Toys remained in their original packaging, gifts from friends and family who'd shared their excitement. Britney walked slowly around the room, taking in every detail with the careful attention of someone who understood the weight of unfulfilled dreams. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "Your baby would have loved it." James felt tears threaten for the first time since the funeral. "I haven't been in here since—" "It's okay to be sad," Britney said. "Grandma Rosa used to cry sometimes when she looked at pictures of my mommy and daddy. She said missing people means you loved them really big." The simple truth of her words broke something loose in James's chest. For 3 years, he'd avoided this room, this reminder of everything he'd lost. But somehow, sharing it with Britney didn't feel like reopening a wound. It felt like honoring a memory. "Would you like to see your room?" he asked, clearing his throat. "My room?" The concept seemed foreign to her. "I get my own room?" They moved to the opposite end of the hallway, where James opened the door to what had been the guest suite. The space was elegant but sterile, cream walls, antique furniture, and artwork that spoke of expensive decorators rather than personal touches. Britney stepped inside cautiously, as if entering a museum exhibit. "It's bigger than Grandma Rosa's whole apartment," she breathed. "What would you like to change about it?" James asked. "We can paint it any color you want, get new furniture, whatever would make it feel like yours." Britney walked to the enormous window that overlooked the back gardens. "Could I have purple walls? Grandma Rosa always said purple was a royal color, but we couldn't paint the apartment because we didn't own it." "Purple walls it is," James said without hesitation. "What else?" "Maybe some books and—" She hesitated, as if afraid to ask for too much. "Could I have pictures of Grandma Rosa and my mommy and daddy?" "Of course. We'll get beautiful frames and put them wherever you want them." That evening, as they sat in the informal dining room eating dinner that Maria had prepared, comfort food rather than the gourmet meals James usually ate alone, Britney continued to marvel at her new surroundings. "Mr. James," she said, carefully cutting her chicken with the proper technique Rosa had taught her, "why are you being so nice to me?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "You don't know me. You could have just visited me in the hospital and gone home to your big house. But you stayed, and now you brought me here, and you're letting me pick purple paint." She paused, considering her words carefully. "Grandma Rosa said when people are too nice too fast, sometimes they want something back." James set down his fork, recognizing the protective wisdom of a child who'd learned to be cautious about adult motivations. "That's very smart advice from your grandmother. Can I tell you why I wanted to help you?" Britney nodded seriously. "When I lost my wife and son, I felt like I was drowning. For 3 years, I've been living in this big house all alone, wondering if I'd ever feel happy again. Then I met you in the hospital, and for the first time since they died, I felt like maybe I could help someone else feel less alone." James chose his words carefully, wanting to be honest without burdening her with the full weight of his grief. "You needed someone to stay with you, and I needed someone to care about. Maybe we can help each other." Britney considered this explanation with the seriousness of someone much older. "So you're not just being nice because you feel sorry for me. I'm being nice because I care about you. There's a difference." "Good," she said decisively, "because I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I want them to like me." "Britney," James said gently, "I already like you very much. And tomorrow, we're going to start figuring out how to make this official so you never have to worry about being alone again." As they finished dinner and Maria showed Britney how to use the intercom system to call for help if she needed anything during the night, James felt the empty house beginning to fill with something it had been missing: purpose. Later that evening, after Britney had fallen asleep in the guest room, clutching her stuffed rabbit and wearing pajamas that Maria had hastily purchased, James sat in his study, making phone calls that would reshape both their futures. His first call was to the contractor who'd renovated the house when he and Elena first bought it. "I need a child's bedroom completely redone by the end of the week. Purple walls, whatever a 7-year-old girl would love." His second call was to his attorney. "Margaret, I need you to file whatever paperwork is necessary for emergency guardianship and start the adoption proceedings immediately." His third call was to his financial advisor. "I want to establish a trust fund for Britney Gomez. Education, medical expenses, everything she'll ever need." As James made arrangements to transform not just a room, but an entire life, he realized that for the first time since Elena's death, he was planning for a future instead of just surviving each day. Upstairs, Britney slept peacefully in a bed larger than any she'd ever known, in a house that felt like a castle, cared for by a man who was quickly becoming the father she'd never had. Neither of them knew that their story was continuing to capture hearts around the world, or that the legal challenges ahead would test every resource James possessed. All they knew was that tonight, neither of them was alone. The crisis began at 2:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Britney had moved into the Hernandez estate. James woke to the sound of screaming, high-pitched, terrified cries that sent him running down the hallway in his pajamas, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found Britney thrashing in her bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare so vivid that she was fighting invisible restraints. Her face was flushed with fever, and when James reached out to wake her, her skin burned against his palm. "Britney, sweetheart, wake up," he said gently, trying to rouse her without startling her further. "You're safe. You're home." Her eyes flew open, wild with confusion and fear. For a moment, she didn't recognize him or her surroundings, and James watched in horror as she pressed herself against the headboard, looking around the purple-painted room as if she'd never seen it before. "Where's Grandma Rosa?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "I want Grandma Rosa. Where am I?"
"You're at my house, remember? You've been staying here with me." James kept his voice calm despite his growing alarm. "Britney, you're burning up. I need to take your temperature." But when he tried to approach with the thermometer, Britney recoiled as if he were a stranger. "I don't know you," she said, panic rising in her voice. "I want to go home. I want my grandma." James felt his own panic begin to build. The fever had clearly triggered some kind of disorientation, possibly related to her head injury from the accident. He needed medical help, but moving a confused, frightened child in the middle of the night would only make things worse. "Maria!" he called out, knowing the housekeeper lived in the guest cottage, but hoping she might hear him. "Maria, I need help!" Within minutes, Maria appeared in the doorway, hastily dressed and immediately taking in the situation. Her maternal instincts kicked in as she approached Britney slowly, speaking in soothing Spanish that seemed to penetrate the child's confusion in a way English couldn't. "Mija, está bien. Está segura aquí," Maria murmured, her voice carrying the comforting rhythm of lullabies. "Let me help you feel better." Something in Maria's tone reached through Britney's fever-induced panic. She allowed the housekeeper to place a cool cloth on her forehead, though she continued to watch James with suspicious, unfocused eyes. "We need to get her to the hospital," James said, already reaching for his phone to call Antonio. "No!" Britney's scream was piercing. "No hospital! They'll take me away! They'll put me somewhere else!" The raw terror in her voice stopped James cold. Even in her fevered state, Britney's deepest fear was abandonment, and she associated hospitals with loss, the place where her secure world with Rosa had ended. Dr. Martinez arrived at the estate 40 minutes later, having been roused from sleep by James's urgent call. The pediatrician took one look at Britney's condition and immediately began examining her, while Maria continued to provide comfort in Spanish. Her temperature is 104.2, Dr. Martinez reported grimly. This could be a delayed reaction to the head injury, or it could be an infection. Either way, she needs immediate medical attention. But not at the hospital, James said firmly. She's terrified of being taken away. Can't we treat her here? Dr. Martinez looked around the luxurious bedroom, then back at James. Mr. Hernandez, I understand your concern, but this child needs more care than I can provide at a home setting. If this is brain swelling related to her concussion, or if she's developing sepsis, then bring the hospital here, James interrupted. Whatever equipment you need, whatever specialists, whatever it costs, I'll have it all here within hours. James, you can't just watch me. James was already dialing his attorney's emergency number. Margaret, I need you to arrange for a full medical team to be set up at my house immediately. ICU-level care. Whatever permits or licenses are required, handle them. While James coordinated the logistics of essentially creating a private hospital wing in his home, Britney's condition continued to deteriorate. Her fever spiked higher, and she began to slip in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently about car crashes and strangers taking her away. By dawn, the Hernandez estate had been transformed into a medical facility. Specialized equipment had been transported from the hospital, a team of nurses was monitoring Britney around the clock, and Dr. Martinez had consulted with neurologists and infectious disease specialists via video conference. But the medical crisis was only the beginning of James's problems. Word of Britney's emergency had leaked to the media, and by 6 a.m., news vans were lined up outside the estate gates. The story had taken on a life of its own. Billionaire creates private hospital to save adopted daughter. Margaret Sullivan arrived with a stack of legal documents and a grim expression. James, we have multiple problems. Child Protective Services is demanding immediate access to Britney. They're claiming you're interfering with proper medical care by keeping her out of the hospital. That's not the point. Patricia Wells is outside with a court order requiring Britney to be placed in state custody, pending a full investigation of your fitness as a guardian. She's also brought reporters who are claiming you're using your wealth to circumvent child protection laws. Through the bedroom window, James could see the growing crowd outside his gates. Protesters had joined the media circuit, some supporting his efforts to care for Britney, others denouncing what they saw as wealthy privilege overriding the rights of child welfare professionals. Mr. James, Britney's weak voice drew his attention back to the bed where she lay surrounded by medical equipment. Her fever had broken slightly, and her eyes were clearer, though she still looked desperately ill. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, taking her small hand in his. "Are they going to take me away?" she whispered. "I heard people talking about courts and custody. Are you in trouble because of me?" The question hit James like a physical blow. Here was a 7-year-old child, seriously ill and fighting for her health, worried that she was causing problems for the man who'd promised to protect her. "No one is taking you anywhere," James said firmly. "I made you a promise, remember? I'm not leaving you alone." "But what if the judge says you have to? What if they make you give me back?" James looked at this brave little girl who'd already lost everyone she'd ever loved, now facing the possibility of losing him too, and felt something harden in his chest. The protective instinct that had been dormant for 3 years roared to life with the force of a hurricane.
"Britney, listen to me carefully," he said, his voice carrying the same authority that had built his business empire. "I have more money than most small countries. I have lawyers, politicians, and judges on speed dial. I have resources that most people can't even imagine." He leaned closer, meeting her fevered gaze. "But more importantly, I have something that matters more than all of that. I have love for you that no court can take away and no amount of bureaucracy can destroy." Outside, Patricia Wells was arguing with the state security, demanding entry with a court order that Margaret was frantically trying to challenge through emergency appeals. Reporters were broadcasting live updates about the custody standoff at the billionaire's mansion. But inside Britney's purple bedroom, none of that mattered. What mattered was a sick little girl who needed to know she was safe, and a man who was discovering that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in boardrooms or courtrooms. They were fought at hospital bedsides, one promise at a time. Dr. Martinez approached with new test results, his expression cautiously optimistic. The fever is responding to treatment, and the latest scans show no signs of brain swelling. I think we're through the worst of it. As Britney's condition stabilized and the immediate medical crisis passed, James realized that the real fight was just beginning. Outside his gates, forces were gathering that would test every resource he possessed and challenge his right to protect the child who'd become his whole world. But looking down at Britney's sleeping face, peaceful now despite the chaos surrounding them, James knew he would move mountains before he'd let anyone take her away. The war for Britney's future was about to begin, and James Hernandez had no intention of losing. The helicopter circling overhead had been there for 3 hours, its news cameras capturing every angle of what media outlets were now calling the mansion standoff. James watched from his study window as the crowd outside his gates swelled to nearly 200 people, protesters, supporters, reporters, and curious onlookers who'd driven from across the state to witness the spectacle firsthand. "This is insane," Margaret muttered, reviewing the latest batch of legal documents that had been served that morning. "We now have involvement from the State Attorney General's office, the Department of Children and Family Services, and something called the Coalition for Child Welfare Reform. They're all demanding different things." James's phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. CNN wanted an exclusive interview. The Today Show was offering a prime-time special. His own board of directors was demanding an emergency meeting about how the media circus was affecting Hernandez Technology stock prices, which had dropped 12% since the story broke. "Sir," come Antonio's voice through the intercom, "there's a woman at the gate claiming to be Britney's aunt. She has reporters with her." James felt his blood turn cold. "What woman?" "Carmen Ruiz. She says she's Rosa Gomez's niece and Britney's legal guardian according to family wishes." Through his study's floor-to-ceiling windows, James could see a woman in her 30s holding what appeared to be legal documents, flanked by cameras and microphones. She was speaking animatedly to reporters, gesturing toward the mansion with obvious anger. Margaret was already pulling up information on her tablet. "Carmen Ruiz, 34, lives in Phoenix. She's Rosa Gomez's sister's daughter. According to public records, she filed a petition for custody of Britney yesterday morning, claiming she was unaware of the child's situation until she saw the news coverage." Where was she when Britney was living with Rosa, when Rosa was working 16-hour days to support her? James's voice carried an edge that his business rivals would have recognized as dangerous. "That's what I intend to find out," Margaret replied grimly. "But James, legally, she has a stronger claim than you do. Blood relative, no criminal record, and she's already filed the proper paperwork." On the television screens that lined James's study, usually tuned to financial networks, every major news outlet was covering what they were calling the battle for Britney. The story had evolved into something much larger than one man trying to help one child. It had become a national conversation about wealth, privilege, family rights, and the foster care system. Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist at Stanford, was being interviewed on NBC. "While Mr. Hernandez's intentions appear genuine, we have to ask whether a traumatized child's attachment to the first stable figure he encountered is being confused with genuine family bonding. Children who've experienced loss often latch eye to anyone who provides safety." On Fox News, former prosecutor Michael Romano was taking the opposite stance. "This is about bureaucratic overreach. A successful, stable man wants to provide a loving home for an orphaned child, and the system is treating him like a criminal because he didn't follow their Byzantine procedures." Meanwhile, social media had exploded into competing hashtags.
Hashtag Let James Adopt was trending alongside hashtag Blood Family First. GoFundMe pages had been set up both supporting James's legal fees and Carmen Ruiz's custody battle. The internet had chosen sides in a fight that was becoming increasingly public and increasingly ugly. James found Britney in the library, where Maria was helping her with a puzzle while keeping her distracted from the chaos outside. Her fever had completely broken, but she remained pale and quiet, clearly sensing the tension that filled the house despite everyone's efforts to shield her from it. "Mr. James," she said when she saw him, "Maria says there are people outside who want to talk to me. She won't let me look out the windows." James knelt beside her chair, choosing his words carefully. "There are some reporters outside, and some people who are concerned about you, but you don't need to worry about any of that right now." "Are they mad at you because of me?" Her question was asked with the directness that only children possessed.
"Some people have different opinions about what's best for you," James said honestly, "but that's not your responsibility to worry about." Britney set down a puzzle piece and looked at him with those serious eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Is someone trying to take me away from you?" The question James had been dreading hung in the air between them. He'd built his fortune by being ruthlessly honest in business dealings, and he couldn't bring himself to lie to the child who'd become his world. "There are some people who think you should live with other family members instead of with me," he said gently. "What family members? Grandma Rosa said we didn't have anyone else." Before James could answer, Margaret appeared in the library doorway with an expression that made his stomach drop. "James, I need to speak with you immediately." In the hallway, Margaret delivered news that changed everything. Carmen Ruiz has produced documents showing that Rosa Gomez named her as Britney's guardian in case of emergency. They're handwritten, witnessed, and notarized. If they're authentic, they supersede any adoption petition you might file. "If they're authentic," James repeated. "You have doubts?" "The timing is convenient. Rosa dies, Britney becomes a media sensation living with a billionaire, and suddenly a relative appears with perfectly documented legal claims." Margaret pulled up photos on her tablet. "Look at this woman's social media history. 3 weeks ago, she was posting about her expensive vacation in Cabo. No mention of having a niece in California. No posts about Rosa's death or concern for Britney's welfare. Then suddenly she's on every news channel talking about family bonds and her desperate desire to raise her beloved niece." James studied the photos. Carmen Ruiz poolside at a luxury resort. Carmen Ruiz shopping at high-end boutiques. Carmen Ruiz at expensive restaurants. The lifestyle didn't match someone who would have been unaware of her elderly aunt's struggles or unable to help with Britney's care. "There's more," Margaret continued. "I had my investigator do some digging. Carmen Ruiz has significant credit card debt. Her mortgage is 3 months behind, and she was recently fired from her job at a marketing firm. The timing of her newfound interest in Britney coincides remarkably well with her financial problems." "She wants the trust fund," James realized. "That would be my guess. The media coverage has made it clear that Britney would inherit significant wealth if you adopt her. Carmen probably sees dollar signs." The revelation should have filled James with righteous anger, but instead he felt something colder and more focused. This wasn't just about legal procedures anymore. This was about protecting Britney from someone who saw her as a meal ticket rather than a child who needs love and stability. "What do we do?" he asked. "We fight. But James, this is going to get uglier before it gets better. Carmen Ruiz has hired a publicity firm. She's planning a press conference for this afternoon where she's going to claim you're keeping Britney from her rightful family out of some misguided savior complex." Through the library windows, James could see more news vans arriving. The media feeding frenzy was intensifying, and Britney was at the center of it all. A frightened little girl who'd already lost everyone she'd ever loved, now being fought over by adults whose motives ranged from genuine love to calculated greed. "Sir," Antonio's voice came through the intercom again, "there's been a development. Someone just delivered an envelope addressed to Britney." The person claimed to be from her Aunt Carmen. James felt his protective instincts surge. Don't let anyone else approach the gates, and increase security around the house. As he returned to the library where Britney was still working on her puzzle, blissfully unaware that her future was being decided by forces beyond her control, James made a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they understood his motivations. He wasn't just going to fight for custody of Britney. He was going to expose every person who saw her as anything other than a child deserving love and protection. And if that meant taking on the media, the legal system, and anyone else who stood in his way, so be it. The war for Britney's future was intensifying, but James Hernandez had resources that Carmen Ruiz couldn't imagine, and a determination forged by 3 years of grief and loss. He would not let anyone use this child for their own gain. Not on his watch. The envelope addressed to Britney sat unopened on James's desk like a loaded weapon. Inside, according to Carmen Ruiz's lawyer, was a handwritten letter from Rosa Gomez explaining why she chose Carmen as Britney's guardian and expressing her dying wish that Britney be raised within the family rather than by strangers, no matter how wealthy or well-intentioned. It's psychological warfare, Margaret observed, studying the envelope with obvious distaste. They're trying to create doubt in Britney's mind about whether staying with you dishonors her grandmother's memory. James picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of whatever manipulation lay inside. Have we heard back from the handwriting expert? Dr. Elizabeth Torrance will be here within the hour. She's one of the best forensic document analysts in the country. Margaret consulted her notes. But James, even if we can prove the letter is forged, Carmen's legal claim as next of kin remains strong. Family courts heavily favor blood relatives, especially when the alternative guardian has no legal relationship to the child. The morning had brought a cascade of new complications. Carmen Ruiz's press conference had been a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Tears, family photos that had clearly been hastily gathered, and heartfelt pleas about honoring Rosa's wishes while reuniting Britney with her real family. The performance had shifted public opinion dramatically. Social media was now flooded with criticism of James's selfish attempt to keep Britney from her blood relatives. Even more disturbing was the revelation that Carmen hadn't come forward alone. She was being backed by a legal advocacy group called Families First Foundation, which claimed to protect children from wealthy individuals who used adoption as a form of charity shopping. Their spokesperson, a polished attorney named David Brennan, had appeared on 3 morning shows arguing that James's case represented dangerous precedent where money could override family bonds. "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. "I've been digging into Families First Foundation. Their largest donor is Preston Blackwood Industries." James felt his blood pressure spike. Preston Blackwood was the CEO of his biggest corporate rival, a man who'd spent years trying to undermine Hernandez Technologies through various underhanded tactics. What's Blackwood's angle here? Think about it. You've been out of the public eye for 3 years, grieving and isolated. Now, suddenly, you're front-page news, emotionally invested in a custody battle that's consuming all your time and energy. Meanwhile, your company's stock is dropping, your board is questioning your judgment, and your business focus is completely scattered. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. He's using Britney to destroy me professionally. It's brilliant, actually. If he'd attacked you directly in business, you would have fought back ruthlessly. But he found your emotional vulnerability and turned it into a weapon. Whether you win or lose custody, your reputation and business empire take massive damage. James walked to his window, looking out at the circus that had taken over his normally pristine grounds. News helicopters circled like vultures. Protesters waved signs demanding Britney's return to her family. And somewhere in that chaos, a little girl was being used as a pawn by adults who saw her as either a meal ticket or a strategic weakness to exploit. "Sir," came Maria's voice through the intercom, "Britney is asking to see you. She heard some of the noise from outside and she's getting upset." James found Britney in the conservatory, sitting curled up in a window seat with her stuffed rabbit, staring out at the gardens where she could see security guards patrolling the perimeter. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of adult conflicts she couldn't understand. "Everyone's fighting about me, aren't they?" she said without looking away from the window. James sat beside her, careful not to crowd her space. "Some people have different ideas about what would be best for you. The lady on TV this morning said she was my aunt. She said Grandma Rosa wanted me to live with her." Britney finally turned to look at James, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Did Grandma Rosa not want me to stay with you?" The question cut deeper than any business betrayal or legal maneuver ever could. James saw Carmen's strategy clearly now. Plant doubt about Rosa's wishes, make Britney feel guilty for wanting to stay with him, create internal conflict that would make the child compliant with whatever the adults decided. "Britney, what do you remember about your grandmother talking about family?" She thought carefully, as she always did when asked important questions. "She used to say that family isn't just about blood. She said the people who love you and take care of you, those are your real family." Britney's voice grew smaller. "But she also said I should always honor her memory and do what she would have wanted." "And what do you think she would have wanted for you?" "To be safe, to be loved, to go to school and grow up happy." Britney looked back out the window at the chaos beyond the gates. "But now I don't know if staying here makes me selfish. What if Grandma Rosa really did want me to live with Aunt Carmen?" Before James could respond, Antonio's voice crackled through the intercom with urgent news. "Sir, there's been a development. A woman named Isabella Morales is at the gate. She claims to have important information about Carmen Ruiz and Rosa Gomez. She says she was Rosa's best friend and neighbor." James exchanged glances with Margaret, who was already pulling up information on her tablet. Isabella Morales, 62, lived in the apartment next to Rosa Gomez for 8 years. No criminal record, works as a school custodian. "Let her in," James decided, "but bring her through the service entrance, away from the media." Isabella Morales was a compact woman with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard her entire life. She wore a simple black dress and clutched a worn purse, clearly uncomfortable in the mansion's opulent surroundings, but determined to speak her piece. "Mr. Hernandez," she began in accented English, "I saw that woman on TV this morning, claiming to be Rosa's loving niece. It made me so angry I couldn't sleep." "What can you tell us about Carmen Ruiz?" Margaret asked gently. Isabella's expression hardened. Carmen Ruiz broke Rosa's heart. When Rosa first got custody of Britney after the parents died, Carmen called maybe 3 times in 4 years. Rosa would cry after those calls because Carmen only contacted her when she needed money. Rosa tried to get Carmen to visit, to meet Britney, to be part of their lives, but Carmen always had excuses. "Did Rosa ever mention making Carmen Britney's guardian?" James asked. "Never. Rosa was terrified something would happen to her and Britney would have no one. She talked about it all the time, especially after she got sick last year." Isabella reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Rosa asked me to witness something she wrote, just in case. She made me promise to keep it safe." With trembling hands, Isabella unfolded a handwritten document that would change everything. In Rosa's careful script, witnessed and notarized, was a will specifically stating that if anything happened to her, Britney should be placed with a loving family who will give her the opportunities and stability I cannot provide. Carmen Ruiz should not be considered, as she has shown no interest in Britney's welfare and only contacts our family when she needs financial assistance. The document was dated 6 months before Rosa's death and included detailed instructions for Britney's care, education, and her grandmother's hope that the child would find parents who will love her as much as I do, even if they are not blood family. Margaret was already photographing the document and preparing to file emergency motions. This changes everything. Rosa explicitly excluded Carmen from guardianship consideration. But Isabella wasn't finished. There's more. Rosa kept a diary about Britney's life, pictures, school reports, everything. She wanted whoever took care of Britney to know how special she was, how much she was loved. Isabella pulled out a thick album from her oversized purse. Carmen never visited, never called on Britney's birthday, never sent Christmas cards. But now she wants to be family because of money? As James flipped through the album, pages of photos showing Britney's life with Rosa, school achievements, birthday celebrations, everyday moments of love and care, he felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just about protecting Britney from people who would use her. This was about honoring the wishes of a grandmother who'd loved her granddaughter enough to ensure she'd find a real family, even if that family didn't share her blood. Outside, the media circus continued to rage, and Carmen Ruiz was probably preparing for another round of interviews designed to paint James as a wealthy man trying to steal a child from her loving family. But inside the mansion, 3 adults and 1 7-year-old girl now held the truth. Rosa Gomez had wanted exactly what was happening. She'd wanted Britney to find parents who would love her unconditionally and give her every opportunity to thrive. The war for Britney's future was far from over, but for the first time since this battle began, James felt like they had a weapon that could cut through all the lies and manipulation: the truth. Rosa's final gift to her granddaughter wasn't money or property. It was the wisdom to choose love over blood, opportunity over obligation, and hope over fear. Now, they just had to convince the world that sometimes the most loving thing a family can do is help a child find an even better one. The family court hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, and by Sunday night, James felt like he was drowning in a perfect storm of legal, media, and personal pressures that threatened to destroy everything he'd tried to build with Britney. The weekend had brought devastating developments. Despite Rosa's authentic will clearly excluding Carmen from guardianship, Carmen's legal team had filed a motion claiming the document was obtained under duress and didn't reflect Rosa's true final wishes. They presented their own handwriting expert who declared Rosa's letter to Britney authentic, creating a conflict of evidence that the judge would have to resolve. Worse still, the family's first foundation had leaked selective portions of James's psychological evaluation to the media. The headlines were brutal: "Billionaire's adoption bid driven by unresolved grief," and "Experts question tech mogul's mental fitness for parenting." The leaked excerpts painted James as a man using Britney to fill the void left by his deceased son, rather than genuinely caring for her welfare. "The character assassination is systematic and professional," Margaret observed grimly as they reviewed the Sunday morning news coverage. "They're not just questioning your legal standing, they're destroying your credibility as a potential parent." The media narrative had shifted dramatically over the weekend. Carmen Ruiz had been photographed visiting children's charities, speaking at a community center about the importance of family bonds, and tearfully describing her desperate need to honor Rosa's memory by raising Britney within their cultural heritage. The images were carefully crafted to present her as a devoted family member fighting against a wealthy man's selfish desires. Meanwhile, protesters had gathered outside the courthouse with signs reading, "Money can't buy children," and "Blood bonds can't be broken." Counter-protesters supporting James were outnumbered 3-1, and the whole scene looked like a public referendum on wealth, privilege, and family rights. But the most devastating blow came Sunday evening when Dr. Patricia Vance from the hospital called with news that made James's blood run cold. "James, I need to warn you about something that's going to surface at tomorrow's hearing. Carmen Ruiz's legal team has obtained Britney's complete medical records from the accident, including notes from her psychological evaluation." Dr. Vance's voice was heavy with regret. "They're planning to argue that Britney's attachment to you is trauma-based rather than genuine familial bonding." "What does that mean?" "They're going to claim that her desire to stay with you stems from Stockholm Syndrome-like symptoms, that she's psychologically dependent on the first stable figure she encountered after her trauma, not genuinely choosing you as a parent." Dr. Vance paused. "James, I don't believe that's true, but their expert witness is Dr. Amanda Cross, and she's very convincing in court."
James felt the walls closing in around him. Every angle of attack had been carefully planned to make him look either mentally unstable, financially motivated, or emotionally manipulative.
Meanwhile, Carmen was being positioned as the perfect blend of loving family member and stable guardian. The final blow came when Britney herself delivered it, though she had no idea of the devastating impact her words would have. "Mr. James," she said as he tucked her into bed Sunday night, "I've been thinking about what that lady said on TV, about honoring Grandma Rosa's memory." James felt his stomach drop, but he kept his voice gentle. "What about it, sweetheart?" "Maybe she's right. Maybe Grandma Rosa really did want me to live with family." Britney's voice was small and uncertain. "I love living here with you, but what if staying here means I'm not doing what Grandma Rosa wanted? What if she's sad in heaven because I chose you instead of Aunt Carmen?" The question that James had been dreading hung in the air between them. Carmen's psychological warfare had worked perfectly. She'd planted doubt about Rosa's true wishes and made Britney feel guilty for wanting to stay with the man who'd become her father. "Britney, what did your grandmother teach you about family?" "She said family takes care of each other and loves each other no matter what." Britney's eyes filled with tears. "But she also said I should always be grateful for my blessings and not be selfish." "Do you feel selfish for wanting to stay here?" "I don't know. Maybe. You give me everything, purple walls and nice clothes and good food and stories. Aunt Carmen doesn't have as much money. Maybe it's selfish to want to stay with you when she needs me too." James felt his heart breaking. Here was a 7-year-old child trying to make adult decisions based on guilt and manipulation, sacrificing her own happiness because she'd been convinced it was the right thing to do. "Britney, can I tell you what I think your grandmother would want for you?" She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I think she'd want you to be happy, to feel safe, and to be with people who love you completely. I don't think she'd want you to make decisions based on money or guilt or what other people think you should do." James chose his words carefully. "I think she'd want you to follow your heart." "But what if my heart is wrong? What if I'm just being a selfish little girl who wants nice things instead of doing what's right for family?" The manipulation was so complete, so devastating in its effectiveness, that James felt rage building in his chest unlike anything he'd experienced in business. Carmen Ruiz and her backers had weaponized a child's love for her grandmother, turning it into guilt and confusion that would haunt Britney regardless of tomorrow's outcome. "Sweetheart, love isn't selfish. Wanting to be safe and happy isn't selfish either. And choosing the family that makes you feel most loved isn't selfish either." James sat on the edge of her bed, looking directly into her eyes. "Tomorrow, there's going to be a big meeting where adults talk about what's best for you. I want you to remember something. Whatever happens, you are loved completely. By me, by Maria, by all the people in this house who've gotten to know you. That love doesn't go away based on what a judge decides." "But what if they make me go with Aunt Carmen? What if I never see you again?" The question that had been keeping James awake at night finally came out of Britney's mouth, and hearing it from her lips made it real in a way that all the legal documents and media coverage hadn't. "Then we'll find ways to stay connected. Letters, phone calls, visits when possible. But Britney, I'm going to fight as hard as I can to keep that from happening." "What if fighting makes things worse? What if they get mad at you for trying to keep me?" James realized that Carmen's strategy was even more insidious than he'd understood. She'd not only convinced Britney to feel guilty about wanting to stay with him, she'd made the child feel responsible for protecting him from consequences. "That's not your job to worry about," James said firmly. "I'm the adult. Protecting you and fighting for you is my responsibility, not yours." As Britney finally fell asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit and wearing the brave expression of a child trying to be stronger than her years should require, James realized that tomorrow's hearing would determine more than legal custody. It would determine whether a manipulative campaign designed to exploit a child's grief and loyalty would succeed, or whether truth and genuine love would prevail. Standing in his study that night, surrounded by legal briefs and media coverage that painted him as everything from a savior to a predator, James felt more alone than he had since Elena's death. The resources that had always been his strength in business seemed inadequate against the emotional manipulation and legal maneuvering that threatened to tear Britney away from the only stable home she'd known. Tomorrow, he would walk into that courtroom carrying not just his own hopes and fears, but the dreams of a little girl who'd learned to trust again, and the final wishes of a grandmother who'd wanted her granddaughter to find a real family. The question was whether that would be enough to overcome the perfect storm of forces aligned against them. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Judge Elizabeth Morrison called the custody hearing to order at 9 a.m. sharp. Media representatives filled the back rows, sketch artists captured every moment, and the overflow crowd spilled into the hallway where supporters and protesters maintained their vigil. James sat at the plaintiff's table with Margaret, acutely aware that the next few hours would determine whether he would drive home with Britney or watch her disappear into a system that had already failed her once. Britney herself sat in the witness waiting room with a court-appointed advocate, spared from watching the legal battle that would decide her fate. James had seen her briefly that morning, pale but resolute, wearing the purple dress that Maria had bought for special occasions. She'd hugged him tightly and whispered, "Whatever happens, thank you for keeping your promise not to leave me alone." Carmen Ruiz entered the courtroom like a grieving family member rather than a contestant in a custody battle. She wore a simple black dress, carried a photo of Rosa Gomez, and was flanked by her attorney David Brennan and a representative from Families First Foundation. The visual was carefully orchestrated: humble family member versus wealthy corporate mogul. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the weathered expression of someone who'd presided over countless family tragedies, reviewed the case files with obvious concern. "This is an unusual situation," she began. "We have a child with no living parents, conflicting documents regarding her grandmother's wishes, and two potential guardians with vastly different qualifications and motivations. My decision will be based solely on what serves Britney's best interests." Carmen's attorney opened with an emotional appeal that had clearly been crafted for maximum impact. "Your Honor, this case represents a fundamental question about family bonds and cultural heritage. Carmen Ruiz is Britney's blood relative, her connection to Rosa Gomez's memory, and her link to the Hispanic community that shaped her identity. Mr. Hernandez, despite his wealth and good intentions, cannot provide the cultural connection and family continuity that Britney needs to honor her grandmother's legacy." Brennan presented Rosa's letter to Britney, the one expressing wishes for family placement, with dramatic flair. Rosa Gomez wrote this letter because she knew her time was limited and wanted to ensure her granddaughter would be raised within their family structure. This document represents a grandmother's dying wish, written in her own hand, witnessed and notarized. When Margaret rose to cross-examine the letter's authenticity, she was prepared with devastating evidence. "Your Honor, we've had this document analyzed by Dr. Elizabeth Torrens, one of the country's leading forensic handwriting experts. While the handwriting appears to match Rosa Gomez's style, the paper composition and ink analysis reveal significant inconsistencies." Dr. Torrens took the stand with the methodical precision of someone who testified in hundreds of cases. The paper used for this letter wasn't manufactured until 8 months after Rosa Gomez's death. The ink contains chemical compounds that weren't available in standard pens during Rosa's lifetime. This document is a sophisticated forgery. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Carmen's face went white, and Brennan frantically whispered with his client as murmurs erupted from the gallery. But Carmen's team had prepared for this possibility. "Your Honor," Brennan responded quickly, "even if questions exist about that particular document, the fundamental issue remains unchanged. Carmen Ruiz is Britney's blood relative, and family reunification should take precedence over placement with an unrelated guardian, regardless of financial resources." The morning continued with a parade of expert witnesses. Dr. Amanda Cross, Carmen's psychological expert, testified that Britney's attachment to James showed classic signs of trauma bonding rather than genuine familial love. Children who experience sudden loss often form intense attachments to the first stable figure they encounter, she explained. This appears to be dependency rather than healthy family bonding. But Margaret's counter-witnesses painted a different picture. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who'd treated Britney since the accident, testified about the child's remarkable emotional progress. Britney has shown consistent improvement in all psychological markers since living with Mr. Hernandez. Her sleep patterns are stable, her anxiety has decreased, and she demonstrates secure attachment behaviors that indicate genuine emotional bonding. The most powerful testimony came from Isabella Morales, who took the stand with Rosa's authentic will and photo album documenting Britney's life. Speaking in careful English supplemented by a court translator, Isabella described Rosa's relationship with Carmen with devastating honesty. Rosa tried for years to get Carmen involved in Britney's life. She would call after birthday or Christmas, crying because Carmen hadn't called or sent a card. Carmen only contacted Rosa when she needed money, for rent, for car payments, for credit card bills. Rosa was heartbroken that her own family showed no interest in Britney. Isabella's testimony about Rosa's explicit instructions regarding Carmen was damning. Rosa made me witness her real will because she was terrified something would happen to her. She said Carmen should never get custody because she had never shown love for Britney, only for what Britney might bring her financially. When Carmen took the stand in her own defense, Margaret's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. Ms. Ruiz, can you tell the court when you last spoke with Rosa Gomez before our death? Carmen shifted uncomfortably. It had been a while. We weren't in regular contact. How long is a while? 6 months? A year? Maybe 18 months. And when was the last time you sent Britney a birthday card or Christmas gift? Family relationships are complicated. Just because we didn't exchange cards doesn't mean… Ms. Ruiz, yes or no? Have you ever sent Britney a birthday card or Christmas gift in the 7 years since her parents died? The silence stretched until Carmen was forced to whisper, no.
Margaret continued relentlessly. You testified that you want to honor Rosa's memory by raising Britney. Can you tell the court what grade Britney is currently in? She's young, elementary school age. She's in 2nd grade. Can you tell the court her favorite subject? Children her age usually like art, reading. She loves mathematics and science. Can you tell the court the name of her best friend at school? Carmen's inability to answer basic questions about Britney's life painted a devastating picture of her disconnection from the child she claimed to love. But the moment that changed everything came when Britney herself was called to testify. Judge Morrison had initially planned to interview her privately, but Carmen's attorney had insisted on open court testimony, believing a 7-year-old would be easily manipulated in front of cameras and crowds. It was the worst miscalculation of the entire case. Britney entered the courtroom with the quiet dignity that had first captured James's heart. She wore her purple dress and carried her stuffed rabbit, looking impossibly small in the witness chair, but speaking with clarity that belied her age. Britney, Judge Morrison said gently, do you understand why we're here today? Yes, ma'am. You're deciding who I should live with. And what would you like to happen? Britney looked directly at Carmen, then at James, then back at the judge. I want to stay with Mr. James, but I want to understand something first. What would you like to understand? Why Aunt Carmen never came to see me when Grandma Rosa was alive, but she wants me now? The question, asked with the innocent directness only children possessed, cut through every legal argument and expert testimony with devastating effectiveness. Carmen's face crumpled, and Brennan started to object, but Judge Morrison held up her hand. Let the child speak. Grandma Rosa used to cry sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking. She would say she wished our family cared more about us. She told me that real family doesn't just show up when they need something. They show up when you need them.
Britney's voice remained steady, though tears began streaming down her cheeks. Mr. James showed up when I needed someone. He stayed with me in the hospital when I was scared. He made me feel safe when I thought I'd never feel safe again. The courtroom was completely silent as this 7-year-old child delivered what would become the most quoted testimony in family court history. I love Grandma Rosa's memory, and I want to honor it. But I think the best way to honor her memory is to be with people who love me every day, not just when it's convenient or when they want something. Carmen's face crumpled, and Brennan started to object, but Judge Morrison held up her hand. Let the child speak. Grandma Rosa used to cry sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking. She would say she wished our family cared more about us. She told me that real family doesn't just show up when they need something. They show up when you need them. Britney's voice remained steady, though tears began streaming down her cheeks. Mr. James showed up when I needed someone. He stayed with me in the hospital when I was scared. He made me feel safe when I thought I'd never feel safe again. The courtroom was completely silent as this 7-year-old child delivered what would become the most quoted testimony in family court history. I love Grandma Rosa's memory, and I want to honor it. But I think the best way to honor her memory is to be with people who love me every day, not just when it's convenient or when they want something. Judge Morrison looked at Carmen, whose tears were no longer calculated for sympathy, but born of genuine shame. Then at James, who was struggling to maintain his composure. "Britney, are you certain about your choice?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. James is my family now. Not because of his money or his big house, but because he loves me and I love him." That's what Grandma Rosa would have wanted, for me to be with people who choose to love me every single day. As Britney left the witness stand and was escorted back to the waiting room, the courtroom erupted in emotional chaos. Carmen was sobbing openly, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. James felt tears streaming down his own face as he realized that a 7-year-old child had just delivered the most powerful argument for their family that any lawyer could have crafted. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess to consider her decision. And James knew that whatever happened next, Britney had already won the most important victory. She had found her voice, claimed her agency, and spoken her truth with a courage that put every adult in the room to shame. The little girl who had whispered, "Please don't leave me alone," in a hospital corridor, had just stood up in front of the world and declared exactly where she belonged. Judge Morrison returned to the bench after a 40-minute recess that felt like an eternity. The courtroom was electric with tension as she arranged her papers and looked out over the packed gallery. Carmen sat slumped in her chair, no longer the confident claimant who'd entered that morning. Her legal team whispered urgently among themselves, clearly recognizing that Britney's testimony had demolished their carefully constructed case. James felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the judge's face for any hint of her decision. Margaret gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles were white, while behind them, supporters and media representatives held their collective breath. "In my 32 years on the family court bench," Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "I have presided over thousands of custody cases. Each one involves real people, real families, and real children whose futures hang in the balance. Today's case has been particularly complex, involving questions of family bonds, cultural heritage, financial resources, and most importantly, the authentic wishes of a remarkable young girl." The judge's eyes moved between the two sides before continuing. "The court has heard testimony about blood relations versus chosen family, about trauma bonding versus genuine attachment, and about the intersection of wealth and child welfare. But ultimately, my decision must be based on one fundamental question. What arrangement best serves Britney's physical, emotional, and developmental needs?" James felt time slow to a crawl as Judge Morrison reviewed the key evidence. She addressed the forged letter that Carmen's team had presented, calling it a calculated deception that undermines any claim of genuine concern for the child's welfare. She noted Rosa Gomez's authentic will, explicitly excluding Carmen from guardianship consideration, describing it as the clear wishes of a grandmother who knew her family dynamics better than any court ever could. However, the judge continued, and James's stomach dropped at the word, the court must also consider whether Mr. Hernandez's lack of formal parenting experience and the unusual circumstances of this relationship create risks to Britney's long-term stability. The pause that followed felt like the entire courtroom had stopped breathing. Carmen's attorney leaned forward hopefully, while James prepared himself for the devastating possibility that love and intention might not be enough to overcome legal precedent and bureaucratic concerns. Having carefully considered all testimony, expert opinions, and documentary evidence, Judge Morrison said, her voice growing stronger, and having been particularly moved by the clear, authentic voice of Britney herself, this court finds that the best interests of the child are served by granting full legal custody to James Hernandez. The courtroom exploded. Supporters erupted in cheers, while Carmen's team sat in stunned silence. James felt his legs nearly give out from relief as Margaret grabbed his arm, tears streaming down her face. Behind them, the gallery was chaos, reporters frantically typing, supporters hugging each other, and camera flashes capturing the moment that would dominate headlines for weeks. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. She called for order and continued with conditions that would shape their future. Mr. Hernandez, this court is granting you custody with several important provisions. First, Britney will receive court-mandated therapy to ensure her adjustment continues positively and to monitor for any signs of the trauma bonding that opposing counsel suggested. Second, you will complete formal parenting classes within 6 months. Third, this custody arrangement will be subject to review in 1 year to ensure Britney's continued well-being. James nodded eagerly, ready to accept any conditions that would allow him to keep Britney safe and loved. Furthermore, the judge continued, while this court finds Miss Ruiz's claim to be legally and morally deficient, Britney should have access to information about her cultural heritage and family history. Mr. Hernandez, you are encouraged to help Britney maintain connections to her Hispanic heritage through appropriate cultural education and community involvement. The final element of Judge Morrison's ruling addressed the broader implications of the case. This court wants to be clear that today's decision is not based on Mr. Hernandez's wealth or Miss Ruiz's lack thereof. Financial resources do not determine parenting fitness. This decision is based on evidence of genuine care, the child's clearly expressed preferences, and the documented wishes of her deceased grandmother. As the judge's gavel fell, declaring the proceedings closed, the courtroom erupted again. James found himself surrounded by well-wishers, reporters, and his legal team, but all he could think about was the little girl waiting in the witness room who was about to learn that she would never have to leave the only stable home she'd known. Margaret fought through the crowd to reach him. James, we need to get you and Britney out of here quickly. The media is going to be intense, and she's been through enough for one day. Court security escorted James through a side door to the witness waiting room, where Britney sat with her court advocate, nervously clutching her stuffed rabbit. When she saw James's face, her own lit up with hope and relief. "Did we win?" she asked simply. "We won," James confirmed, kneeling down to wrap her in a hug that he'd been holding back all morning. "You're coming home with me, and you never have to worry about being taken away again." Britney burst into tears, not of sadness, but of pure relief. "Really? Forever? Forever and always," James promised, holding her close as she sobbed into his shoulder. The court advocate, a kind woman named Sarah Chen, who'd spent the morning helping Britney understand the proceedings, wiped her own eyes as she watched the reunion. "Mr. Hernandez, I've worked with hundreds of children in custody situations. I've never seen a child fight so bravely for what she believed was right." As they prepared to leave the courthouse through a service exit to avoid the media circus, Britney stopped and looked back toward the courtroom. "What's going to happen to Aunt Carmen?" she asked. James was struck again by this child's capacity for empathy, even towards someone who tried to manipulate her grief for personal gain. "I don't know, sweetheart, but that's not your responsibility to worry about." "I feel sad for her," Britney said thoughtfully. I think she was lonely and scared about money, and that made her do something wrong. But I'm glad the judge understood that love is more important than being related by blood. Outside the courthouse, despite security's best efforts, they were met with a wall of reporters and cameras. James held Britney's hand tightly as they pushed through the crowd toward the waiting car, but the questions shouted from all directions were overwhelming. Mr. Hernandez, how does it feel to officially become a father? Britney, are you happy with the judge's decision? What's your response to critics who say wealth shouldn't influence custody decisions? James paused at the car door, making a split-second decision to address the media directly rather than letting others control the narrative. With Britney beside him, he faced the cameras and spoke from his heart.
Today isn't about money or legal victories. Today is about a little girl who lost everything and found the courage to believe in family again. Today is about keeping promises and proving that love creates bonds stronger than any biological connection. He looked down at Britney, who was watching the crowd with the serious expression that had become so familiar to him. Today is about honoring the memory of Rosa Gomez, who raised an extraordinary granddaughter and wanted her to find a family who would love her unconditionally. Britney stepped forward slightly, looking directly into the cameras with surprising poise. I want to say thank you to everyone who supported us, and I want other kids who don't have families to know that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you are the ones who choose to love you every day. As they drove away from the courthouse, the media circus, and the legal battle that had consumed their lives for weeks, James felt something settle in his chest that had been missing since Elena's death. Peace, purpose, the unshakable knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the person he was meant to protect and love. Britney fell asleep in the car, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day, her hands still clutching James's fingers, as if afraid he might disappear. Looking at her peaceful face, James realized that winning custody was just the beginning of their story together. They had a lifetime of bedtime stories, school events, teenage heartbreaks, and family memories ahead of them. They had the chance to prove that families built on love and choice could be just as strong, maybe stronger, than those created by accident of birth. Most importantly, they had each other, and that was enough to build a beautiful life on. 2 years later, James stood in the kitchen of their home on a Saturday morning, making pancakes while Britney sat at the counter doing homework that wasn't due until Monday. At 9 years old, she'd grown taller and more confident, but she still preferred to stay close to him during weekend mornings, as if these quiet moments together were too precious to waste sleeping in. "Dad," she said, looking up from her math worksheet, "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you can come speak to our class about entrepreneurship next week." The word "dad" still sent a warm rush through James's chest, even though Britney had been using it naturally for over a year. The formal adoption had been finalized 6 months after the custody hearing, a quiet ceremony in Judge Morrison's chambers with just family present. James, Britney, Maria, Antonio, and Margaret, who'd become more friend than attorney over the course of their legal journey. "I'd love to," James replied, flipping a pancake with the skill he'd developed through countless Saturday morning practice sessions. "What should I tell them about business?" "Tell them about the Britney Foundation," she suggested, with the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing the nonprofit organization that had grown from James's initial desire to help other children like her. The Britney Foundation had started as James's way of channeling the public attention from their custody battle into something positive. What began as a simple scholarship fund for children aging out of foster care had evolved into a comprehensive support system, providing housing, education, job training, and family reunification services. The foundation now operates in 12 states and had helped over 3,000 young people transition to independent, successful lives. "Speaking of the foundation," James said, setting a plate of perfectly golden pancakes in front of her, "we got the final report on the Phoenix program yesterday. Do you want to hear the numbers?" Britney's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm she'd developed for their foundation work. Over the past 2 years, she'd become actively involved in program planning, often suggesting improvements based on her own experiences in the system.
Her insights had led to some of their most successful initiatives, including the mentorship program that paired former foster children with current ones. 47 kids found permanent families, 32 aged out into stable housing with job training support, and 15 were reunited with relatives who'd completed family preservation programs. And the best part, Carmen Ruiz graduated from the Phoenix program last month. She's working as a social worker now, helping other families navigate the system. The transformation of Carmen Ruiz had been one of the most unexpected developments of the past 2 years. After losing the custody battle and facing criminal charges for document forgery, Carmen had hit rock bottom. But instead of pressing for maximum prosecution, James had worked with prosecutors to arrange a plea deal that included community service with the foundation and mandatory counseling. The experience had forced Carmen to confront her own trauma and financial desperation, leading to genuine personal growth. "That makes me happy," Britney said thoughtfully. "I think she was just scared and didn't know how to ask for help the right way. People do bad things sometimes when they're afraid." James marveled at his daughter's emotional maturity. Therapy had helped her process the complex emotions around Carmen's manipulation, but Britney had arrived at forgiveness through her own generous spirit. She'd even asked to write Carmen a letter when she graduated from the program, congratulating her on finding a better way to help children. The doorbell rang, interrupting their quiet breakfast. Through the window, James could see Maria arriving with her grandson Diego, a boy about Britney's age who'd become her closest friend. Behind them came a familiar figure that made both James and Britney smile. Dr. Patricia Vance from the hospital, who'd become like a surrogate grandmother over the past 2 years. "Abuela Pat," Britney called out, using the honorary title she'd given the retired hospital administrator who visited every few weeks to check on their family's progress. "Buenos dias, mi amor," Dr. Vance replied, accepting Britney's enthusiastic hug. "I brought someone special to meet you." Behind Dr. Vance stood a girl about 13 years old with the same cautious expression and guarded posture that Britney had carried during her first weeks at the mansion. James recognized the signs immediately. Another child who'd learned to protect herself by expecting disappointment. "This is Sofia Martinez," Dr. Vance explained. "She's been in the hospital for a few days after a difficult placement situation, and she doesn't have anywhere safe to go while we work out her case." James and Britney exchanged a look that communicated volumes. Over the past year, their home had become an informal emergency placement for children in crisis, with James's legal guardianship and resources allowing them to provide immediate stability while social workers arranged longer-term solutions. They'd helped 11 children so far, some staying for days, others for months, each one leaving with the knowledge that safe families existed and love was possible. "Hi, Sophia," Britney said gently, moving toward the newcomer with the careful approach she'd learned was least threatening to traumatized children. "I'm Britney. Are you hungry? My dad makes the best pancakes in California." As they prepared lunch for their expanded group, James watched Britney naturally take on the role of big sister and guide, helping Sophia feel welcome while respecting her need for space. The transformation from the terrified 7-year-old he'd found in the hospital to this confident, compassionate young person never ceased to amaze him. Later that afternoon, while the children played in the garden under Maria's watchful eye, James found himself in his study video conferencing with foundation directors across the country. The organization had grown beyond anything he'd imagined possible, but it remained deeply personal, guided by Britney's insights and their shared commitment to ensuring no child felt as alone as they both once had. "The congressional hearing on foster care reform is scheduled for next month," reported Sandra Williams, the foundation's executive director. "Senator Rodriguez wants both you and Britney to testify about the need for increased funding for family preservation programs." James looked out the window at Britney, who was teaching Sophia how to properly plant tomato seeds in their vegetable garden. The same garden where she'd learned to trust again, where she'd discovered that homes could be permanent and love could be unconditional. "We'll be there," he confirmed. "Britney's been preparing her testimony for weeks. She wants to tell Congress about the difference between being placed somewhere and being chosen by somewhere." That evening, as had become their tradition, the extended family gathered around the dinner table. James, Brittany, Maria, Diego, Dr. Vance, and now Sophia, who was beginning to relax enough to ask for seconds of Maria's famous chicken and rice. The conversation flowed between English and Spanish, encompassing school gossip, foundation updates, and gentle encouragement for Sophia to share whatever she felt comfortable revealing about her situation. After dinner, James found Brittany and Sophia in the library, where Brittany was reading aloud from one of the books that had helped her process her own grief and loss. Sophia listened with the intense attention of someone hungry for stories that acknowledged pain while promising hope. "Dad," Brittany said when she noticed him in the doorway, "I told Sophia about how scared I was when I first came here, and how you promised you wouldn't leave me alone. She wants to know if that promise extends to her too, while she's staying with us." James looked at Sophia, seeing himself reflected in her desperate hope mixed with protective skepticism. "Sophia, you're safe here for as long as you need to be. That's not just a promise, it's a guarantee. And when you're ready to move on to whatever comes next, we'll help make sure it's somewhere you want to be, not just somewhere you're sent." As he tucked both girls into their respective bedrooms that night, Brittany in her purple sanctuary, Sophia in the guest room that had been redecorated specifically for visiting children, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The mansion that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter, conversation, and the comfortable chaos of a home where children felt safe enough to simply be children. The fortune that had once felt purposeless now funded programs that were transforming lives across the country. The grief that had once threatened to consume him had been transformed into a fierce determination to ensure other people didn't have to suffer the same losses. Standing in the hallway between the bedrooms of two children who'd found safety under his roof, James realized that the scared little girl who'd whispered, "Please don't leave me alone," in a hospital corridor had given him the greatest gift possible: the chance to rebuild his life around love, purpose, and the simple but profound act of choosing each other every single day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children who need help, new opportunities to prove that families could be created through intention and maintained through commitment. But tonight, his house was full of the people he'd chosen to love and who'd chosen to love him back. It was more than enough. It was everything. In her purple bedroom, Brittany fell asleep clutching the same stuffed rabbit she'd held during those first terrifying nights, but now it was a comfort object rather than a lifeline. In the guest room, Sophia lay awake listening to the sounds of a peaceful house and beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story might have a happy ending too. And in his own room, James fell asleep not to the silence that had haunted him for years, but to the gentle sounds of a home filled with love, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of a family that had chosen each other against all odds. The little girl who'd asked him not to leave her alone had taught him the most important lesson of his life: that the best families aren't born, they're built, one promise kept at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.